The chlorine burned my lungs as I sank to the bottom of my own pool, my summer dress floating around me like a shroud, while 20 feet above, my daughter-in-law Stephanie laughed and told everyone Grandma needed to cool off anyway. I couldn't swim, never learned how, and as my chest screamed for air, I realized that if I drowned right there at my own family barbecue, she'd probably call it an accident and collect the insurance money before my body was cold. I'm Margaret Chen, 67 years old, and I spent 43 years building a life that my daughter-in-law decided to demolish in 30 seconds. What she didn't know was that some of us old ladies keep receipts, and I'd been keeping hers for 3 years. Before I tell you how I made her pay for every cruel laugh, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It will really help me in this phase. Because stories like this remind us that underestimating a grandmother is the last mistake some people ever make. Now, let me tell you exactly how I turned her world upside down. The July heat was crushing that Saturday afternoon, 95 degrees of thick air that made my clothes stick to my skin. But I still hosted our annual family barbecue because Harold and I had done it for 37 years, and I wasn't going to let his death or Stephanie's cold look stop me now. The backyard was full of folding tables with red checkered cloths, the smell of charcoal mixing with my potato salad, and there was Stephanie by the pool in her expensive swimsuit, watching me serve sweet tea like I was the hired help instead of the woman who owned this house. I was standing by the pool's edge, holding the heavy glass pitcher in my tired hands, when she came up behind me with that fake sweet voice saying, "Margaret, you look so hot. Your face is all red. I'm worried you might faint." Everyone stopped talking and stared at me, 20 pairs of eyes looking at my sweaty hair and shaking hands, and before I could say I was fine, she pressed both hands against my back and shoved me hard toward the water. The pitcher flew from my hands as I fell, sweet tea spraying everywhere before the glass shattered on the concrete, and then I hit the pool with a huge splash that soaked half the guests. The water closed over my head and panic grabbed me because I never learned to swim. Harold always meant to teach me, but we ran out of time, and now I was drowning in my own pool while everyone watched. When I finally came up gasping and choking, my dress see-through and my makeup running down my face, they were all laughing like it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. Even my son David just stood there embarrassed instead of helping, until Tyler, my grandson, jumped in fully clothed and pulled me to safety while Stephanie rushed over with a towel saying, "Oh my God, Margaret, I thought you could swim. I was just trying to help you cool off." I sat there on the pool chair dripping wet, my flower dress stuck to my body like plastic wrap, showing everything underneath while makeup ran down my cheeks in black streaks that made me look like a sad clown, and I could feel every eye on me as I tried to cover myself with a towel that smelled like Stephanie's expensive laundry soap instead of the familiar scent of my own home. Stephanie moved through the crowd like an actress on stage, her hand pressed to her heart as she told anyone who would listen how terrible she felt, how she never would have suggested I cool off if she'd known I couldn't swim, how she was just so worried about me overheating at my age, and the guests nodded and patted her arm like she was the victim in all this, while I sat there shivering in the July heat. When David finally walked over, I thought maybe, just maybe, my son would stand up for me, would see through her act and ask if I was okay, but instead he knelt down with that embarrassed look on his face and whispered, "Mom, it was just an accident. Stephanie feels terrible about what happened. Maybe you should go inside and change clothes." The word accident hit me like a slap because we both knew it wasn't, but he chose to believe her lie rather than face the truth about the woman he married. And as the party continued around me with people laughing and drinking like nothing had happened, I realized I was completely alone, even surrounded by my own family. That night after everyone left and I finally peeled off my chlorine-soaked clothes, I saw the purple bruises on my ribs from hitting the pool edge and stood there looking at Harold's photo on the dresser, whispering, "Harold, she thinks I'm too old to fight back. She has no idea what you taught me about patience." And for the first time since he died, I felt him smiling back at me like he knew something good was coming. As I sat there that night staring at my bruises, my mind started putting together pieces I'd been ignoring for 3 long years, like how at David's promotion dinner last spring Stephanie had accidentally knocked over her glass of red wine right onto my white dress, the one Harold had bought me for our anniversary, and how she'd made such a big show of apologizing while I spent the whole night looking like I'd been stabbed, or how she forgot to tell me about Tyler's school play where he won first place, claiming she thought David had already invited me when she knew damn well he'd been out of town on business that week. I remembered how she'd moved the coffee table 6 inches to the left so I'd bump into it in the dark, then acted so concerned about my clumsiness when I bruised my shin, or how my blood pressure pills started looking different, and my doctor wondered why my numbers were getting worse until I realized the bottle felt lighter and the pills looked like the vitamin C tablets from her medicine cabinet. There was the time she scheduled David's birthday party for the same day as Harold's memorial service, forcing me to choose between honoring my dead husband and celebrating my living son, then telling everyone how sad it was that I was still stuck in the past when I chose Harold's memory over cake and balloons. Every single incident had felt random at the time, just bad luck or Stephanie being scattered and thoughtless, but sitting there with chlorine still burning my nose and bruises blooming across my ribs, I finally saw the truth that had been staring me in the face for 3 years. I'd been making excuses for her, calling it clumsiness, calling it accidents, calling it anything but what it really was, but drowning people don't care if you call it an accident when they're the ones holding your head underwater. The next morning I woke up with my ribs aching and my mind clearer than it had been in years, because sometimes it takes almost drowning to realize you've been slowly suffocating for a long time, and I knew I couldn't keep pretending Stephanie's cruelty was just bad luck or forgetfulness when she'd been systematically trying to erase me from my own life. I walked into Harold's old study, a room Stephanie had been pushing me to modernize for months, and sat at his heavy oak desk where he used to pay bills and handle his business, running my fingers along the wood grain until I remembered something he'd told me years ago about keeping important things where only I would think to look. Behind his favorite photo of us at Niagara Falls, I found a small key taped to the back of the frame, and my heart started racing as I realized what it might open, leading me to the old filing cabinet where Harold had kept his most private papers, and there in the bottom drawer was a metal box I'd never seen before with a note in his careful handwriting that said, "If anyone ever tries to erase you, use this." Inside the box was like finding buried treasure, but instead of gold there was a business card for a private investigator named Jake Morrison, copies of financial records I didn't know existed, and a small digital recorder with fresh batteries, and a note that said, "Trust your instincts, document everything, and remember that patient people always win in the end." I felt something shift inside me as I held that recorder, like I was waking up from a long sleep where I'd forgotten I had claws, and I realized Harold had been preparing for this day even when I couldn't see it coming, giving me the tools to fight back against someone who thought I was too old and too weak to defend myself. That very afternoon, I hid the tiny recorder in the kitchen windowsill behind the herb pots, and within hours I caught Stephanie on the phone with one of her country club friends, her voice sharp and mean as she said, "The old bat almost drowned today." It was hilarious watching her flail around like a dying fish. Maybe next time I won't pull her out so fast because David's too weak to stop me and she's too proud to tell anyone what really happened. Hearing those words through the speaker that night, I smiled for the first time since the pool incident, because now I had proof of what I'd always known but could never prove, and Stephanie had no idea that the old bat was about to show her what real power looked like. Armed with Stephanie's recorded confession, I called Jake Morrison the next morning, and when this gruff-voiced private investigator met me at a quiet diner across town, I handed him the audio file and watched his eyebrows raise as he listened to my daughter-in-law casually discussing my near drowning like it was entertainment. Jake was a big man with kind eyes who reminded me of Harold, and he spent 2 weeks digging into Stephanie's finances while I kept playing the role of the confused old woman, smiling and nodding while she made her cruel little comments about my age and memory. When Jake called me back to the diner with a thick folder of papers, his face was grim as he spread out copies of loan applications, credit card statements, and bank records that made my blood run cold. "Margaret," he said quietly, "she's been forging your signature for over 2 years, taking out loans in your name, and using your credit to fund her shopping sprees, spa treatments, and that fancy car she drives around town." The paper showed thousands of dollars in debt I never knew existed, all tied to my name and social security number. But that wasn't even the worst part, because Jake had also discovered something called the Golden Years Foundation, a fake charity Stephanie had created to launder money from my accounts into her personal spending. She'd been telling people she was helping elderly women in need while actually helping herself to my life savings. And as I stared at the forged documents with my name signed in handwriting that looked close but wasn't quite right, I felt a cold anger settle in my chest like ice. I started keeping a notebook that night, writing down every detail, every date, every dollar amount, because I learned that revenge isn't a dish best served cold. It's best served with receipts, timestamps, and notarized evidence that no lawyer in the world can argue with. With Jake's evidence burning in my hands and my notebook filling up with Stephanie's crimes, I thought I was ready for anything, but I underestimated how desperate a cornered snake could become, and within days of my meeting with a private investigator, Stephanie started a new campaign that was more dangerous than anything she'd done before. She began questioning my memory in front of David, asking me about conversations we'd never had and appointments I'd never made, then looking concerned when I couldn't remember things that had never happened, saying things like, "Margaret, we talked about this yesterday, don't you remember?" while David watched with growing worry in his eyes. She started moving my reading glasses so I couldn't find them, then acting surprised when I seemed confused, and she'd hide my car keys and suggest maybe I shouldn't be driving anymore because people our age sometimes forget where they're going, even though I'd been driving the same routes for 40 years without a single accident. The worst part was when she began staging little incidents to make me look unstable, like putting salt in the sugar bowl so my coffee tasted terrible and I'd spit it out looking crazy, or calling my doctor's office to cancel appointments I'd made, then acting shocked when I showed up anyway and the receptionist said I wasn't on the schedule. I overheard her on the phone with David one night, her voice dripping with fake concern as she said, "I'm really worried about your mother, honey. She's been so forgetful lately. Maybe we should look into getting her some help, professional care." And I realized she was building a case to have me declared incompetent so she could take control of everything I owned. But Harold had taught me to be patient and thorough, so I bought tiny cameras from an electronics store and hid them around the house, in the kitchen clock, behind picture frames, even in the fake plant she'd put in the hallway, and I started recording every conversation, every cruel comment, every staged incident she thought no one would ever see. Tyler began noticing things too, asking me quietly why Stephanie was always helping me remember things that didn't sound right. And when I showed him one of the recordings of her moving my pills around and replacing them with vitamins, his young face went hard with anger as he whispered, "Grandma, she's trying to make you sick. We have to stop her." And I knew I finally had an ally who could see through her perfect act to the monster underneath. With Tyler on my side and cameras recording Stephanie's every move, I decided it was time to stop playing defense and start playing offense. So I began acting exactly like the confused old woman she was trying to convince everyone I was, shuffling around the house looking lost, asking the same questions twice, and pretending to forget conversations we'd had just hours before. The more helpless I acted, the bolder Stephanie became, leaving her fake charity paperwork on the kitchen counter instead of hiding it, talking louder on her phone calls about my declining mental state, and even bringing strangers to the house to look at my antique furniture while telling them I probably wouldn't remember selling it to them anyway. She started treating me like I was already gone, walking into my bedroom without knocking, going through my mail right in front of me, and making plans for my money like I was too stupid to understand what she was saying. But every cruel word and careless action was being recorded by the cameras she didn't know existed. Jake Morrison had given me the perfect bait to set my trap, a fake financial document that looked like a property transfer form for the house, and I left it on Harold's desk in the study where I knew Stephanie would find it during one of her snooping sessions, then pretended to take a nap while actually watching through the hidden camera as she crept into the room like a thief in the night. I watched her eyes light up as she read the document, watched her hands shake with excitement as she realized what it meant, and watched her pull out a pen to forge my signature with the same careful strokes she'd been practicing for years, not knowing that this time the pen had special ink that would show up under forensic testing, and the paper had a hidden watermark that would prove it was fake. Within an hour, she was on the phone with her lawyer, trying to fast-track the property transfer and talking about how sad it was that I'd become so confused I was signing away my own house. But she had no idea that every word was being recorded and every document was being copied by Tyler, who had become my secret partner in this elaborate game of chess. As I sat in my rocking chair that night, listening to the recording of her celebrating what she thought was her victory, I smiled and whispered to Harold's photo. She thought she was stealing my house, but she was actually signing her own arrest warrant, because sometimes the best traps are the ones where the prey catches themselves. 3 days after Stephanie signed the fake property transfer, she called a family dinner with that smug smile I'd grown to hate, and as we sat around the dining room table that Harold and I had bought 30 years ago, she cleared her throat like she was about to make some grand announcement that would change all our lives. "I've been talking to David about what's best for Margaret," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern while she cut her steak with precise little movements. "And we think it's time she moved somewhere she can get the care she needs, professional help for people with her condition." David nodded along like a puppet, not meeting my eyes as Stephanie continued her performance, talking about a lovely assisted living facility she'd already toured, with activities and nurses and other people Margaret's age who would understand her problems better than family could. I played my part perfectly, looking confused and a little scared as I asked what she meant by condition, and Stephanie leaned forward with that practiced look of pity, patting my hand like I was a child as she explained how I'd been having episodes lately, forgetting things, getting mixed up, even becoming dangerous to myself and others. "It's for the best, Margaret," she said, her voice getting stronger as she warmed to her topic. "You've been having these episodes where you don't remember what's real and what isn't, like yesterday when you tried to drown yourself in the pool, claiming I pushed you when we all know you just fell in because you were confused." Tyler's fork clattered against his plate as he stared at her in shock, but David just sat there nodding like everything she said made perfect sense, and I realized this was her final move, the moment she'd been building toward for 3 years, painting me as a crazy old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own life. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, looking around the table with wide, frightened eyes like the helpless victim she thought I was, and then I smiled, really smiled for the first time in months, as I reached into my purse and pulled out a small digital recorder that had been running the entire dinner. "Actually, Stephanie," I said, my voice clear and strong and nothing like the confused old woman I'd been pretending to be, "the only episode I've been having is recording every single lie you've told for the past 3 months, and honey, you just gave me the best one yet." The color drained from Stephanie's face as I placed the recorder on the table between the salt and pepper shakers, and for the first time in 3 years I saw real fear in her eyes instead of that calculating coldness she usually wore like expensive jewelry. "What is that?" David asked, his voice shaky as he stared at the little black device like it might explode, and I smiled as I pressed play, filling the dining room with Stephanie's own voice from just days ago saying, "The old but almost drowned today. Maybe next time I won't pull her out so fast because David's too weak to stop me and she's too proud to tell anyone what really happened. David's mouth fell open as he heard his wife's cruel laughter echoing through the room, but that was just the beginning because I had hours of recordings stored on my phone, and I played them one after another while Stephanie sat frozen in her chair like a deer caught in headlights. There was the conversation where she bragged about replacing my heart medication with vitamins, the phone call where she discussed having me declared incompetent, and the recording from just yesterday where she told her lawyer friend that the crazy old woman signed away her house and doesn't even remember doing it. But the audio was nothing compared to what came next because I pulled out my tablet and showed them the video footage from the hidden cameras, crystal clear recordings of Stephanie moving my pills, hiding my glasses, and forging my signature on document after document while she thought I was napping upstairs. This isn't real. Stephanie finally found her voice. But it came out high and desperate as she pointed at the screen. She's making this up. She's sicker than we thought. She probably hired actors or something. David was staring at the videos with his face getting redder by the minute, watching his wife systematically abuse his mother while he'd been at work thinking everything was fine, and when the footage showed her pushing me into the pool, he made a sound like someone had punched him in the stomach. Tyler stood up from his chair, his young face hard with anger as he looked directly at his stepmother and said, "I saw you do it. I was right there when you pushed Grandma into the pool, and I've been watching you be mean to her for years while Dad pretended not to notice." Stephanie turned on him like a cornered animal, her voice getting shrill as she snapped, "You're just a kid. Nobody will believe you over me. I'm the one who takes care of this family while your grandmother sits around feeling sorry for herself." But I wasn't done yet because Jake Morrison had given me copies of all the financial documents, and I spread them across the table like playing cards, showing David the forged loan applications, the fake charity paperwork, and the credit card statements that proved his wife had been stealing from me for over 2 years. "She took out loans in my name, David," I said quietly, watching my son's face crumble as he realized the extent of his wife's betrayal. "She created a fake charity to launder my money, and she's been slowly poisoning me while planning to have me declared crazy so she could take everything I own." Stephanie was babbling now, trying to explain away each piece of evidence with increasingly desperate lies, claiming the recordings were fake, the videos were doctored, and the financial documents were some kind of mistake. But her voice got higher and more frantic with each excuse until she sounded exactly like the unstable person she'd been trying to convince everyone I was. I stood up slowly, my hands steady as I gathered the evidence back into my purse, and looked down at the woman who had tried to erase me from my own life. "You pushed me into that pool thinking I was too weak to climb out," I said, my voice calm and clear as a bell. "But some of us learn to swim in deeper waters than you'll ever know." The doorbell rang at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, and I opened it to find 2 police officers standing on my front porch with serious faces and official paperwork, Detective Sarah Martinez and Officer James Chun, who had been briefed by Jake Morrison about everything we discovered over the past month. "Mrs. Chun," Detective Martinez said with a respectful nod, "we have a warrant for the arrest of Stephanie Harrington on charges of elder abuse, financial fraud, identity theft, and attempted murder. Is she currently in the residence?" I nodded and invited them in, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and satisfaction as I led them through the house I'd almost lost to the woman who was about to lose everything herself. Stephanie was in the kitchen making her usual elaborate breakfast, humming some pop song while she arranged fresh fruit on expensive china like she didn't have a care in the world, completely unaware that her carefully constructed life was about to come crashing down around her perfectly styled head. When she saw the officers, her face went through a series of expressions, confusion first, then recognition, then the kind of panic that comes when someone realizes their lies have finally caught up with them. "Stephanie Harrington," Detective Martinez said in a clear, professional voice, You're under arrest for elder abuse, financial fraud, identity theft, and attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Stephanie's coffee mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the kitchen floor, hot liquid splashing across her expensive shoes. And she stared at the mess like she couldn't understand how something so perfect could break so completely. Then the screaming started as she denied everything while the officers read her rights, pointing at me and shrieking, "She's lying. She's a crazy old woman. I've been taking care of her for years." Officer Chen put the handcuffs on while she accused me of ruining her life, but her words made her sound exactly like the unstable person she'd been trying to convince everyone I was. David came running downstairs in his bathrobe, and the look on his face when he saw his wife in handcuffs was shock and shame as he realized he'd chosen the wrong side. "David, tell them your mother is sick," Stephanie pleaded, but David just stood there staring at her, and when she demanded he choose, he looked at me with tears and said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have protected you." The door closed behind her, and suddenly the air felt cleaner. The legal process moved fast because Jake had documented everything, and police found she'd been running similar scams on 2 other elderly women in town, using her volunteer work to find victims. At the restitution hearing, I sat with Tyler and David watching the judge order her to pay back every stolen penny plus damages, over $200,000 she'd taken from me and others to fund her shopping and vacations while we struggled to pay for medicine. Her lawyer tried to claim she was a victim too, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the judge read the final charges, elder abuse, financial fraud, identity theft, attempted murder, and conspiracy, the courtroom went silent, and I felt deep satisfaction as each count was announced. Stephanie would spend the next 15 years in prison, and even if she got out early for good behavior, she'd be a convicted felon with no money, no reputation, and no family to support her, because David had already filed for divorce, and Tyler had made it clear he never wanted to see her again. As we walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunshine, David put his arm around my shoulders and said, "I know I can't undo the damage I let happen, but I want to try to make things right." And I patted his hand and told him that forgiveness was a process, not a moment, but we had time to work on it together. That night I sat on my front porch with a cup of tea, looking out at the garden Harold and I had planted together, and for the first time in 3 years I felt truly safe in my own home, knowing that the woman who had tried to erase me was now just a memory, a cautionary tale about what happens when you underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has survived longer than you've been alive. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making Tyler's favorite pancakes on a Saturday morning that felt like a gift from heaven. The sunlight streaming through windows that no longer held the shadow of Stephanie's presence, and I smiled as I heard my grandson's footsteps on the stairs, the sound of someone who belonged in this house, instead of someone who was plotting to take it away from me. The newspaper on the counter had a small article buried on page 6 about Stephanie beginning her 15-year sentence at the Women's Correctional Facility 2 hours north of town, and while I didn't take pleasure in anyone's suffering, I felt a deep sense of justice, knowing that she was finally paying for the pain she'd caused not just to me, but to the other elderly women she'd victimized with her fake charity and forged documents. David had been going to therapy twice a week since the trial, working through his guilt about choosing his wife over his mother for so many years, and though our relationship was still healing like a broken bone that needed time to grow back stronger, he'd started calling me every Sunday and visiting every other weekend, bringing flowers from the grocery store and apologies that came from a place of real remorse instead of obligation. Tyler had moved in with me permanently after his father agreed it would be better for everyone, and having my grandson's laughter fill the house again reminded me what it felt like to be surrounded by people who truly loved me instead of people who saw me as an obstacle to overcome or a resource to exploit. The biggest change in my life wasn't the legal victory or the financial restitution, though getting my money back had certainly made things easier, but the way I felt about myself, stronger and more confident than I'd been since Harold died, like I'd rediscovered a part of myself that had been buried under years of trying to keep peace with someone who was waging war against my very existence. I'd started volunteering at the senior center, where Stephanie used to hunt for victims, helping other elderly people recognize the warning signs of financial abuse and emotional manipulation, sharing my story not for sympathy, but as a roadmap for anyone who found themselves in a similar situation. The other volunteers treated me with a respect I hadn't felt in years, asking for my advice on difficult cases and listening when I spoke instead of dismissing me as a confused old woman whose opinions didn't matter. And I realized that surviving Stephanie's cruelty had taught me lessons about strength and resilience that I could pass on to others who needed them. But the most symbolic change happened on a warm Tuesday afternoon in late spring when I walked out to the pool that had been the scene of my humiliation and near drowning, the same pool where Stephanie had pushed me thinking it would be the beginning of my end. And instead of seeing it as a place of trauma, I saw it as an opportunity to reclaim something she'd tried to take from me. I'd hired a swimming instructor, a patient woman named Linda, who specialized in teaching older adults, and as I stood at the edge of the water in my new one-piece swimsuit, I thought about how different this moment was from that terrible day 6 months ago when I'd fallen and gasping and choking while everyone laughed. This time I was choosing to enter the water, choosing to learn something new at 67 years old, choosing to turn a place of fear into a place of empowerment, and when I took my first tentative steps down the ladder, Tyler cheered from his chair on the deck, like I was winning an Olympic medal. Learning to swim at my age wasn't easy, and there were moments when the water still triggered memories of panic and helplessness, but Linda was patient and encouraging, teaching me to float first, then to move my arms and legs in coordination, and gradually I began to understand what Harold had always said about water being a friend instead of an enemy if you knew how to work with it instead of fighting against it. After my third lesson, I floated on my back in the shallow and while Tyler sat nearby doing his homework, and I looked up at the sky through the water droplets on my eyelashes, feeling a peace I hadn't experienced since before Stephanie entered our lives, a sense that I had not only survived her attempts to destroy me but had emerged stronger and more whole than I'd been in years. That evening, as we sat on the porch eating ice cream and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Tyler asked me if I ever regretted fighting back instead of just moving away and starting over somewhere else, and I thought about his question for a long moment before answering. "Sweetheart," I said, watching a butterfly land on the roses Harold and I had planted 20 years ago, "they say revenge is a dish best served cold. But I learned something different through all of this. I learned that revenge isn't really about getting even with someone who hurt you. It's about refusing to let them win. It's about standing up and saying, I matter. My life has value. And you don't get to erase me just because you think I'm too old or too weak to fight back." I took his hand in mine, feeling the strength in his young fingers and remembering the strength I'd found in my own when I needed it most. "Real revenge isn't served cold, Tyler. It's best served with justice, patience, and the kind of strength that only comes from surviving someone who tried to erase you and discovering that you're still here, still standing, still worthy of love and respect, and a life that belongs to you and nobody else." Stephanie thought pushing an old lady into a pool would be the end of my story. Instead, it was the beginning of hers ending. If you enjoyed watching karma catch up to someone who deserved it, click that like button and subscribe for more stories about people who learned not to underestimate the quiet ones. And remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to disappear. Thank you for listening to me. I am more than thankful to you. Subscribing to my channel will help me a lot in this phase, and it will give me courage to bring more interesting stories to you. Also like the video and share this story with someone who really needs to hear this.